2 o'clock in the afternoon, March 6, 1945. The streets of Cologne, Germany. The city is in ruins. The great Gothic cathedral, the twin-spired Kölner Dom that has dominated the skyline of the Rhine for 600 years, is still standing, somehow, in the middle of a flattened urban wasteland. Allied bombers have dropped over 45,000 tons of explosives on this city since 1942. The cathedral has been hit 14 times. It is scarred, scorched, its windows blown out, its statues chipped. But it is still standing, the way Cologne Cathedral has stood through every war, every fire, every catastrophe in the Rhineland since the Middle Ages. And on this afternoon, in the rubble-strewn square in front of it, a German Panther tank is hiding. The Panther belongs to the 9th Panzer Division. Its commander is Oberleutnant Wilhelm Bertelborth. He has positioned his tank carefully, just off the corner of An den Dominikaner Street, gun pointed down the avenue, waiting for the American armor that everyone in Cologne knows is coming. The cathedral square is the kill zone. Anything that turns the corner into that square will be hit, frontally, at point-blank range, by a high-velocity 75mm round that no American tank in the European theater has ever consistently survived. He has already killed 2 Shermans this morning. He has the angles, he has the weight. He is patient. He has been a tank commander for 3 years. Around the corner, idling in a side street, is the tank that is about to change the next 50 seconds of military history. It is not a Sherman. It is the largest, heaviest, most powerful American armored vehicle of the entire war. The crew has named it Eagle 7. Its commander is Sergeant Robert Early. Its gunner, sitting in the turret with his eye to the periscope, is a 21-year-old corporal from Allentown, Pennsylvania, named Clarence Smoyer. The loader is John Derrigui, wearing a French tanker's helmet he traded for somewhere outside Paris. The driver is William McVeigh. The bow gunner is Homer Davis. They have been fighting together since the previous September. They have been fighting in M4 Shermans for most of that time. But the tank they are sitting in now is not a Sherman. It is something new. It is the M26 Pershing. Crouched at a mezzanine window of a damaged office building overlooking the square, with a 16mm motion picture camera and a press credential from the United States Army Signal Corps, is Technical Sergeant Jim Bates of the 165th Photographic Signal Company. He has just told Early what is around the corner. He has just told him there is a monster waiting. Early has hopped down from his tank, walked to the corner with Bates, looked at the Panther through binoculars, climbed back into Eagle 7, given the order to advance, and arranged with Bates exactly where the Pershing will stop and exactly which way the gun will be facing when it stops. What is about to happen will be filmed. Bates will roll 48 seconds of color film that will, in time, become the single most reproduced piece of tank combat footage of the Second World War. It will appear in documentaries for the next 80 years. It will be replayed at the Pentagon, at Fort Knox, at West Point, at every military school in the Western world. Clarence Smoyer will fire 3 rounds in 25 seconds. The Panther will be hit on the right side of the hull, just below the turret, then again, then again. It will catch fire. The crew that survives the first hit will try to bail out. 2 of them will be killed on the cobblestones. The Panther will burn for 3 days. The footage will, decades later, win Clarence Smoyer the Bronze Star at the age of 96, awarded at a surprise ceremony at the National World War II Memorial in Washington in September of 2019. He will accept it standing next to Joe Caserta, another Pershing crewman who was at Cologne that day. He will be the last surviving member of the Eagle 7 crew. But all of that is in the future. On March 6, 1945, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the M26 Pershing is a tank that almost did not arrive at all. It is a tank that the United States Army nearly refused to build. It is a tank whose existence was opposed for almost 2 years by senior officers who insisted that America did not need it. And it is a tank that, even when it finally reached Europe, did so in such tiny numbers, with such limited combat exposure, that historians have spent the 80 years since arguing about whether it should ever be counted as a Second World War tank at all. Of the more than 2,200 M26 Pershings produced by the Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan and the Detroit Tank Arsenal of Chrysler, fewer than 20 saw combat in the European theater. 310 reached the European theater before VE Day, but most of them were in port facilities, supply depots, replacement pools, or training cadres. The Pershing, as a fighting weapon, fought for approximately 10 weeks. Then the war in Europe ended. This is the story of how that happened. It is the story of an engineering program that was technically sound, that produced a tank capable of defeating any German armor on the battlefield, that was delayed for reasons that had almost nothing to do with engineering, and that arrived in service just in time to take 3 confirmed kills in Cologne, generate the most famous tank combat film of the war, and then be shipped to a Japan that surrendered before its tanks could fire a shot. It is also, less famously, the story of the same tank reappearing in Korea 5 years later and proving that the engineering decisions made in 1943 had been the right ones, only made too slowly to matter when they were originally needed. The famous American tank of the Second World War is the M4 Sherman. It is on the cover of every popular history of the war. It is in every documentary. It is the tank that landed at Omaha Beach, the tank that broke out of Normandy, the tank that drove with Patton across France, the tank that liberated Paris, the tank that crossed the Rhine. There were 49,000 of them built. They fought on every front of the war except the Eastern Front, where the Soviets used their Lend-Lease Shermans on every front from Stalingrad to Berlin. The Sherman is, properly, famous. The Pershing is not famous. It is in some of the books, it is in some of the museums, it appears briefly in some of the documentaries, usually in the Cologne footage, and rarely in any other context. But the popular memory of the war in Europe is a Sherman memory. The popular memory of the war in the Pacific, when it includes tanks at all, is also a Sherman memory. The Pershing has been folded out of the story almost completely. The reason for this is partly that the Pershing arrived too late, and partly that the story of why it arrived too late is a story about American military decision-making that the post-war narrative has not been comfortable telling. To understand the M26 Pershing, you have to understand a problem the United States Army refused to see, and a man named Leslie McNair who made sure they did not see it. The problem was simple. The M4 Sherman had been designed in 1941 and early 1942 to fight German tanks, specifically to fight the German tanks that American planners knew about in 1941, which were the Panzer III and the early models of the Panzer IV. The Sherman was an excellent tank for fighting Panzer IIIs. Its 75mm gun, firing armor-piercing M61 ammunition, could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer III at 1,200 yards. Its armor protected the crew adequately against the 50mm guns that the Panzer IIIs carried. Its mechanical reliability was, by the standards of any tank in any army in the world in 1942, extraordinary. The Sherman could march hundreds of miles between overhauls. It could be repaired in field workshops. It could be built in any of 15 American factories that already had the manufacturing capability to handle large-scale armored vehicle production. It was the right tank for the right enemy at the right time, and through 1942 and into the spring of 1943, it performed exactly as designed. Then, the Germans introduced the Panther. They introduced the Tiger. They upgunned the Panzer IV with a long-barreled 75mm gun that could penetrate a Sherman at 1,500 yards. They produced the Panther in numbers, hundreds per month by the middle of 1943. They produced the Tiger in smaller numbers but in operational concentrations. By the summer of 1943, the American 75mm gun on the Sherman could no longer penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at any practical combat range. The Sherman's armor could not stop a Panther's gun or a Tiger's gun at any practical combat range. The tank balance had changed. The vehicle that had been adequate in 1942 was inadequate in 1943, and everyone in the U.S. Army's armored community could see it. The question was what to do about it. The answer, in the U.S. Army of 1943, depended on whom you asked. If you asked the armored officers in the field, you got one answer. If you asked Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, you got the opposite answer. And the answer that mattered was McNair's, because McNair controlled the procurement priorities and the doctrinal decisions for the entire ground combat establishment of the United States Army. Leslie J. McNair was an artillery officer. He had spent his career in the artillery branch. He had risen to senior command through the artillery system, and his understanding of how a modern army should fight was deeply shaped by the artillery tradition. McNair believed that artillery, properly employed, could defeat any enemy on the battlefield. He believed that tanks were specialized infantry support and exploitation weapons. He believed, most importantly, that enemy tanks were not the business of friendly tanks. Enemy tanks, in McNair's doctrine, were the business of tank destroyers. Tank destroyers, in McNair's conception, were lightly armored, highly mobile vehicles carrying powerful anti-tank guns. They would move quickly to threaten sectors, ambush enemy armor with their high-velocity guns, and retreat before they could be destroyed in return. The Army built thousands of them. The M10, the M18 Hellcat, the M36 Jackson. Each carried a more powerful gun than the contemporary Sherman. Each was, in theory, the right answer to the German armor problem. The Sherman would do the infantry support and exploitation. The tank destroyers would handle the German tanks. The doctrine was elegant, internally consistent, and based on a fundamental misreading of how armored warfare was actually being conducted on the Eastern Front and would be conducted in Western Europe. The doctrine produced, in practice, a tank force that was not designed to fight tanks. When American Shermans encountered German Panthers in Normandy in 1944, the tank destroyer doctrine collapsed within weeks. Tank destroyers were not always where they needed to be. Tank battles happened at ranges where the tank destroyer's thin armor became fatal. American Sherman crews found themselves outgunned and out-armored against an enemy that the doctrine had said would be someone else's problem. By August of 1944, American tank crews were writing home about it. By September of 1944, the after-action reports were piling up at 12th Army Group headquarters. The Sherman was inadequate, the tank destroyer doctrine was failing, and the U.S. Army knew it. But McNair had been clear, going back to the autumn of 1943, that he did not see a problem. In a letter to Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, who was at that time the senior American representative in the European theater and was pushing hard for accelerated production of what would become the M26, McNair wrote that the M4 Sherman, particularly the M4A3 variant, had been widely hailed as the best tank on the battlefield. He wrote that there were indications the enemy concurred in this view. He wrote that the M4 was an ideal combination of mobility, dependability, speed, protection, and firepower. He wrote that there was no indication the 76mm anti-tank gun was inadequate against the German Mark VI Tiger tank. He wrote all of this in late 1943, after the Battle of Kursk had ended, after the Wehrmacht had concluded its first full year of operations with Panthers in service, after every armored officer who had seen the new German tanks in action had reported that the Sherman could not stand up to them. McNair wrote it anyway, because the doctrine he had built required him to write it. Devers did not agree. Devers had been chief of the armored force from 1941 to 1943, and he understood, in a way McNair did not, that American armored doctrine had to change if American tank crews were going to survive a campaign against the new German armor. Devers wanted the T-26, as the future M26 was then called, in production immediately. He wanted 250 of them produced as quickly as the factories could turn them out. He wanted to issue them on a scale of 1 T-26 per 5 Shermans, similar to the British practice with the 17-pounder Sherman Firefly. He could not get McNair to authorize the order. McNair, citing the doctrinal arguments and the production logistics arguments and the unproven nature of the new tank, kept saying no. In December of 1943, Devers went over McNair's head. He took the case to General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall, who had been receiving the same battle reports from Europe and had been listening to his armored officers with growing concern, overruled McNair. He authorized the production of 250 T-26E1 tanks. The order went out in January of 1944. The order, however, did not produce tanks. It produced a contract. Production of the T-26E3, as the engineering version was eventually designated, did not begin until November of 1944. Between the contract award in January 1944 and the first production tanks in November 1944, 10 months passed. During those 10 months, American Shermans landed at Normandy, broke out at St. Lo, raced across France, fought through the hedgerow country, fought through Operation Cobra, fought through the Falaise Pocket, fought through the Lorraine Campaign, fought through the Hurtgen Forest, fought through Operation Market Garden, and ground their way into the early stages of what would become the Battle of the Bulge. The Pershing, the tank that had been ordered in January, was not there. The Sherman crews who needed it were the ones who paid for that 10-month delay. The 3rd Armored Division alone, in which Clarence Smoyer and his crewmates were serving, lost 648 Shermans completely destroyed in combat during the European campaign, with another 700 knocked out and repaired. Belton Cooper, an ordnance lieutenant in the same division, would later write a memoir called Death Traps about what he saw. The title was not metaphorical. The tank that the contract had been ordered for had begun its engineering life in May of 1942. The Ordnance Department, working in parallel with the production of the Sherman, had launched an exploratory program for what it called the T-20 series, a family of medium tanks intended to succeed the M4. The T-20 series went through several configurations, each one a learning experience for the engineering team. The T-20 itself had a torsion bar suspension, a 76mm gun, and a Ford GAA engine, the same V8 that powered the M4A3 Sherman. The T-22 was a variant with a different transmission. The T-23 used a controversial electric transmission, in which the engine ran a generator and the generator drove electric motors on the drive sprockets. The T-23 was tested at Fort Knox and at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The electric transmission proved unreliable in field use, with overheating problems in the generator that no one had been able to solve. The T-23 was dropped from consideration as a service tank, though dozens of pilot examples were built. The T-25 and the T-26 emerged from this evolution. Both used mechanical torque-matic transmissions in place of the electric drive. Both mounted a 90mm gun, scaled up from the anti-aircraft M3 90mm that had been adapted for the M36 tank destroyer. The T-25 was lighter, with thinner armor. The T-26 was heavier, with the armor thickness that armor crews actually wanted. The Ordnance Department, after extensive testing, recommended the T-26. The Armored Force, after extensive testing, also recommended the T-26. The Army Ground Forces, under McNair, did not recommend the T-26. But Marshall's December 1943 decision had bypassed that opposition. The tank that finally emerged from the engineering process was a remarkable piece of work for an American design team that, until 1942, had never built a tank in this class. The M26 weighed approximately 42 tons. Its hull was welded from rolled homogeneous armor plate. Its turret was cast as a single piece from a steel foundry that had spent the previous decade casting locomotive parts. The frontal armor on the gun mantlet was 4½ inches thick. The upper front hull was 4 inches thick. The turret's sides were 3 inches thick. The armor was sloped in the manner that the Soviets had pioneered with the T-34 and the Germans had adopted with the Panther, so that the effective protection was greater than the nominal thickness implied. The Pershing's frontal arc was, for practical purposes, immune to the standard German 75mm long-barreled gun at any combat range. It could be penetrated by an 88mm Tiger gun at certain ranges and angles, but not easily and not consistently. The engine was the Ford GAF, a slightly modified version of the GAA V8 used in the M4A3 Sherman, producing 500 horsepower. The transmission was the Torque-Matic, a hydraulic torque converter system that gave the driver smoother gear changes than the manual transmissions used in earlier American tanks. The suspension was a true torsion bar system, with the road wheels independently sprung on transverse torsion bars running across the hull. This was a significant improvement over the vertical volute spring suspension of the early Sherman, which had been a 1930s design carried forward into a 1940s vehicle. The Pershing handled rough terrain better than the Sherman, gave the crew a smoother ride, and produced a more stable gun platform. The main armament was the M3 90mm gun. This was a long-barreled, high-velocity weapon descended from the M1 90mm anti-aircraft gun that had entered service in 1940. The M3 fired a 15-pound armor-piercing round at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. With the standard M82 armor-piercing capped round, it could penetrate 122 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor plate at 1,000 yards, struck perpendicular. With the high-velocity armor-piercing T-33 tungsten cord round, which entered limited production in late 1944, penetration was substantially higher, sufficient to defeat the frontal armor of a Panther or the side armor of a Tiger at any practical combat range. In other words, the M26 Pershing carried a gun that could kill anything in the German inventory and armor that could protect its crew against most things in the German inventory. For the first time since the early Shermans had landed in North Africa in 1942, the American Army had a tank that did not require its crews to maneuver desperately for flank shots or accept casualties on a one-for-one basis with the German armor. The M26 could fight head-to-head. It could fight at range. It could absorb hits that would have destroyed a Sherman and continue functioning. It was, in every meaningful respect, the tank that the American tank crews of 1944 should have had. But they did not have it. In November of 1944, when production finally began, the first M26s rolled off the lines at the Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan, operated by the Fisher Body Division of General Motors. By the end of the year, 40 tanks had been built. 20 of them were immediately set aside for shipment to Europe. The other 20 went to Fort Knox for testing and training. In December of 1944, with 20 production M26s loaded aboard a transport ship in Baltimore Harbor, the Ordnance Department assembled what it called the Zebra Mission. The mission was led by Major General Gladian M. Barnes, the head of the Research and Development Service of the Ordnance Department. Barnes was 61 years old, an engineer by training, and one of the men whose decade-long advocacy for a heavy American tank had been crucial to getting the M26 program approved in the first place. He had spent the entire war fighting bureaucratic battles inside the War Department to keep tank development moving forward against McNair's preferences. Now, with 20 of the tanks he had championed loaded for Europe, Barnes flew across the Atlantic to personally supervise their introduction to combat. The Zebra mission included ordnance officers, civilian technicians from the manufacturers, and a 90mm gun specialist from Aberdeen Proving Ground. Their job was to train the receiving units, troubleshoot the mechanical and gunnery problems that always arise when a new weapon enters service, and produce a combat evaluation that would be used to refine the design for future production. The mission was scheduled to arrive in Paris on February 9, 1945. The tanks themselves were already in transit. They had left New York in early December. The transport carrying the M26s arrived at the port of Antwerp in January of 1945. Antwerp was, by then, the principal supply port for the Allied armies in northwestern Europe. The Scheldt estuary had been cleared in November 1944, and the port had begun operating at scale. The 20 Pershings were unloaded onto the docks, examined for shipping damage, and processed through the depot system. 2 units were selected to receive them, the 3rd Armored Division and the 9th Armored Division. Both divisions were veterans of the European campaign. Both had been heavily engaged during the Battle of the Bulge, which had ended just weeks before the Pershings arrived. Both were now refitting for the spring offensive that everyone knew was coming. Within a few weeks, the tanks were being distributed to the chosen crews. 10 Pershings went to the 3rd Armored Division and 10 went to the 9th. The crews were selected from among the most experienced Sherman tankers in each division. They were veterans, men who had been fighting since Normandy or earlier. They were given approximately 3 weeks to transition from their Shermans to the Pershings, with instruction from the ordnance technicians and gunnery practice on captured German equipment. The 3rd Armored's Pershings were assembled at Stolberg, just east of Aachen. Clarence Smoyer, the Allentown gunner who would become famous in Cologne, first saw a Pershing at Stolberg in early February of 1945. He had been a Sherman gunner for the previous 5 months, fighting through Belgium and into the Hurtgen forest. He was 21 years old. He had grown up in a small Pennsylvania town. He had been drafted in 1943, sent through basic training and armored training at Fort Knox, shipped to England in the spring of 1944, and assigned to a Sherman crew that had landed at Normandy in late June. He had survived the breakout, the Falaise Gap, the race across France, the Hurtgen, the Bulge. By February of 1945, he was the kind of veteran tank gunner that the Zebra mission had been looking for. He took to the Pershing immediately. He found the 90mm gun easier to aim than the 75mm on the Sherman. The optics were better. The stabilization, while still primitive, was more consistent. He recalled later that the first time he fired the 90 at a target, he was startled by the muzzle blast. Each crew during training fired 28 rounds of main gun ammunition. By the end of the training period, they were accustomed to the flash, the smoke, and the recoil. The Pershings entered combat in stages. The first significant engagement came on February 26th and 27th, 1945, near Elsdorf, a village in the Rhineland-Westphalia region between Aachen and Cologne. Task Force Wellborn of the 33rd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division was advancing toward Elsdorf when it encountered a German counterattack from the Heavy Panzer Battalion 301, which fielded Tiger I heavy tanks. The first M26 lost in combat was destroyed during this engagement, hit by a Tiger at close range. The next morning, Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik commanded T-26E3 No. 40 in a position overwatching the road into Elsdorf. A Tiger I was advancing into the village from the German side. Mashlonik's tank, the Pershing, fired 4 rounds of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. The first round struck the Tiger's frontal armor. The Tiger stopped. Subsequent rounds destroyed it. Mashlonik then engaged and destroyed 3 additional German armored vehicles in the same action. Elsdorf was captured. The Pershing's first major combat engagement had ended in a clear American victory, and the new tank had demonstrated for the first time in American service that it could kill Tigers head-to-head with armor-piercing rounds. A week later, on March 6th, the 3rd Armored Division entered the western suburbs of Cologne. The German garrison was disintegrating, but pockets of resistance remained, particularly in the urban core, where the Wehrmacht had positioned anti-tank guns and a small number of Panthers to delay the American advance. The American intent was to clear the city block by block, supporting infantry with armor. The Shermans of the supporting tank battalions were doing most of the work. The Pershings of the 32nd Armored Regiment were operating in mixed formations, with 1 or 2 Pershings interspersed with 3 or 4 Shermans in each tank company. Eagle 7 was Bob Early's tank. The crew had transitioned to it from a Sherman called Eagle 7 in their previous tank. Early had named the new tank for the old one. The crew, including Clarence Smoyer, had been together since the previous September. They were a battle-experienced team operating a tank that, although new to them, was being driven and fought by men who knew exactly what tank combat in a European city actually felt like. At about 2 in the afternoon, Jim Bates, the Signal Corps cameraman, found Early's tank idling at an intersection a few blocks from the cathedral. Bates told Early about the Panther. Early scouted with Bates, returned to the tank, briefed his crew, and gave the order to move. McVeigh, the driver, eased Eagle 7 forward. Bates, in the mezzanine window with his camera running, captured what happened next. Eagle 7 came around the corner. The Panther was where Bates had said it would be. Smoyer's first round hit the Panther on the right side of the hull. The second and third rounds followed within seconds. The Panther caught fire. 2 of its crew died trying to escape. The film ran out. The footage was edited and shipped to the United States, where it appeared in movie house newsreels within weeks. The American public, sitting in dark theaters in Cleveland and Atlanta and Los Angeles, watched a Pershing kill a Panther in Cologne and concluded that the American Army finally had a tank that could fight on equal terms with German armor. The other Pershing engagement of historical note in that period was at Remagen, the bridge on the Rhine that the 9th Armored Division captured intact on March 7, 1945. M26 Pershings from the 9th Armored were among the first vehicles to cross the Ludendorff Bridge before German engineering attempts to destroy it succeeded in dropping it into the river 10 days later. The Pershings established the first American armored bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine, the river that German propaganda had described for years as the impassable barrier. With Pershings rolling across that bridge on March 7th, the strategic momentum of the European war was complete. The Allies were across the Rhine. The German army had no further natural defense line short of the Elbe. What the M26 did not do in the European war was anything else of particular significance. The 20 Pershings that had arrived in January fought through March and April. They participated in the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket. They drove east through central Germany. They were on hand at the meeting with Soviet troops at the Elbe River. But the war was, by then, almost over. The German army was collapsing. The Wehrmacht had no fuel, no coherent command, no functional armored reserve. The tank versus tank combat that the M26 had been built for had largely disappeared from the European battlefield by mid-March. The Pershings, when they fired their guns at all, were firing at fortified buildings, at scattered anti-tank guns, at the occasional Panther or Panzer IV that emerged from a side street. There were no great armored battles. There was no Pershing equivalent of the M4 Sherman crew's grim duels with Panthers in the Lorraine in November of 1944. The tank that the American Army had needed in 1944 had arrived just as the conditions that required it disappeared. Between November 1944, when production began, and the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, approximately 1,400 M26 Pershings were built. By October 1945, when production was wound down, the total had reached 2,212. Of those, only the original 20 Pershings of the Zebra mission saw combat in Europe. A second shipment of 40 arrived in March of 1945 and was assigned to the 2nd and 5th Armored Divisions, but these tanks reached their units only in the final weeks of the European War. 310 M26 Pershings were in the European theater on VE Day. 2,000 other Pershings, more or less, were either still in factories, in shipment, in depots in the United States, or scheduled for deployment to the Pacific. They had been built, but they had not yet been used. The intended next destination for the M26 was the Pacific. The fighting on Okinawa in the spring of 1945 had revealed the limits of the M4 Sherman against Japanese fortified positions. The Japanese had emplaced anti-tank guns in coral caves, in tunnel complexes, in concrete pillboxes that the 75mm Sherman gun could not always reduce with a single round. The Sherman, in the Pacific, was being used primarily as a close infantry support weapon, like the Marine M4A2 diesels that had fought at Cape Gloucester and Saipan. A more powerful gun, with more powerful high-explosive shells, would have been useful. The 90mm on the Pershing fired a substantially heavier high-explosive round than the Sherman's 75. In June of 1945, 12 M26 Pershings were shipped to Okinawa for combat evaluation against Japanese positions, accompanied by an Ordnance Department mission similar to the Zebra mission. The articles arrived on the island in late July. They were assembled, prepared for action, and integrated with the existing tank units of the 10th Army. They never fired a shot in combat. On August 6th, an atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. On August 9th, another fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The Pershings on Okinawa were loaded back onto transports and sent home, or transferred to other commands in the Pacific occupation. The tank that had been designed to fight Tigers and Panthers in Europe had finished its first war, never firing its main gun at an enemy more than 20 times. The story would have ended there, with 2,200 Pershings sitting in storage yards or being scrapped for post-war metal recovery, except that a war the United States had not anticipated broke out 5 years later on the other side of the world. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea with 250 Soviet-built T-34-85 tanks. The T-34-85 was the standard medium tank of the Soviet Army in 1945. The North Koreans had received hundreds of them as Soviet military aid. South Korea had no tanks. The Republic of Korea Army's anti-tank weapons consisted of 2.36-inch bazookas that could not penetrate the T-34's frontal armor. The American occupation force in Japan had been issued a small number of light tanks, the M24 Chaffee, which was inadequate against a T-34. The North Korean armored advance through South Korea was, for the first 6 weeks of the war, almost unopposed. On July 5, 1950, a hastily assembled American force called Task Force Smith engaged a North Korean armored column near Osan, south of Seoul. Task Force Smith had 406 men, 6 105mm howitzers, and a few bazookas. They had no tanks. They were overrun by the North Korean 107th Tank Regiment with 33 T-34-85 tanks. The American force was scattered. The survivors retreated south. The pattern continued for the next month as American forces, fighting alongside the Republic of Korea Army, were pushed back to a defensive perimeter around the southeastern port city of Busan. The Busan perimeter was the last defensible position in South Korea. If it fell, the war was lost in its first month. The American command in Tokyo, under General Douglas MacArthur, understood that the Busan perimeter would not hold without American tanks capable of defeating the T-34-85. The Army's response was to dig into its storage yards for any operational M26 Pershings it could find. The Tokyo Ordnance Depot had a number of Pershings that had been left over from the abandoned Pacific deployment of 1945. These were inspected, rebuilt, and rushed to Korea. The 8072nd Medium Tank Battalion, hastily assembled, sailed for Busan with Pershings aboard. They went into combat on August 2, 1950. By the middle of August, additional Pershing-equipped battalions were arriving from the United States. The 70th Tank Battalion landed on August 7th. The 73rd Tank Battalion was committed to the perimeter shortly afterward. The combat that followed proved that the engineering decisions made in 1943 had been correct after all. The M26 Pershing, fighting the T-34-85 in the rice paddies and hill country of southeastern Korea, demonstrated a clear technical superiority. The 90mm M3 gun penetrated the T-34-85's frontal armor at any practical combat range. The T-34-85's 85mm gun could, with luck and good range, penetrate the Pershing's frontal armor, but the Pershing's superior gun, optics, and crew protection meant that in tank-versus-tank engagements, the Americans came out ahead. A formal Operations Research Office study conducted in 1950 and 1951, designated ORO-S45, analyzed every tank-versus-tank engagement of the Korean War to that point. The study found that American tanks achieved first-round hit accuracy of approximately 66% for the M4A3E8 Sherman and 69% for the M26 Pershing. Soviet tanks were not credited with comparable accuracy. American crews, better trained and better optically equipped, simply hit more often. The most famous American armored engagement of the early Korean War occurred in late August of 1950 at a place American troops called the Bowling Alley, north of Daegu. The North Korean 105th Armored Brigade had crossed the Noktong River and was attempting to push down a valley toward Daegu in a night attack. American infantry from the 27th Infantry Regiment, supported by Pershings of the 73rd Tank Battalion, established a defensive position across the valley floor. The North Korean armor, advancing in column down the road, was engaged in the dark. The lead tanks were destroyed at point-blank range. The following tanks, attempted to deploy off the road, were destroyed in turn. By morning, the bowling alley was a wreckage of T-34/85s, knocked out by Pershings firing at ranges of less than 500 yards. The North Korean armored offensive against Daegu collapsed. The Pusan perimeter held. Through August, September, and the first half of October 1950, the M26 Pershing fought the T-34-85 across southern Korea. The Incheon landing on September 15, 1950, broke the North Korean army strategically, and the pursuit north toward the Yalu River destroyed what remained of the North Korean armored force. By the time Chinese forces intervened in November of 1950, the North Korean tank arm had been essentially eliminated. The remaining tank combat of the Korean War would be sporadic. The Chinese intervention did not bring significant Chinese armor to the front. Tank versus tank combat from 1951 onward was rare. The Pershings of the 8072nd and 70th and 73rd and other tank battalions spent the rest of the war in infantry support roles, a role for which they had not been specifically designed, but which they performed adequately. The tank that had arrived too late for the war it was built for had arrived exactly in time for a war nobody had built it for, and had performed there with the kind of effectiveness that would have changed the European battle had it arrived a year earlier. The M26 had finally fought the kind of armored engagements that justified its design. It had done so in a war that the planners of 1943 had never imagined, against an enemy who had inherited the tank that the M26 had been designed to defeat. It was, in some sense, the war the Pershing had always been meant to fight, just transposed 5 years forward and 4,000 miles east. The Pershing did not remain in frontline service long after Korea. The Army had been working since 1948 on an improved version, designated the M26 Patton. The M46 used the same hull and turret as the M26, but received a new engine, a new transmission, and a new gun with an improved bore evacuator. The M46 reached Korea in the late summer of 1950 alongside the M26s and progressively replaced them. The M46 itself would be replaced by the M47 in 1952 and the M48 in 1953, both of which traced their lineage directly back to the M26. The Pershing's basic design, with refinements, would carry forward through the Patton series of medium tanks into the 1970s. The M60, the standard American tank of the Cold War era, was the last evolutionary descendant of the M26. From 1945 to the mid-1980s, every American main battle tank shared an identifiable engineering heritage with the tank that 21-year-old Clarence Smoyer fired in front of Cologne Cathedral. In September of 2019, 96-year-old Clarence Smoyer of Allentown, Pennsylvania, was awarded the Bronze Star Medal in a surprise ceremony at the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. He had been invited to Washington under the pretext of signing copies of a recent book about his crew, Spearhead, by Adam Makos. When he arrived, he found a full Army color guard, a Pershing tank parked nearby for display, and the citation for his Bronze Star being read aloud. He stood at attention. He listened. He was the last surviving member of the Eagle 7 crew. The others had all died over the previous 74 years, Bob Early in 1980, William McVeigh in 1989, John DeRiggi in 2001, Homer Davis in 2014. Smoyer was alone, by then, with the memory of 48 seconds of film shot on a Cologne afternoon in March of 1945. He had not made it home with his Bronze Star. He had spent the next 74 years working as a machinist in eastern Pennsylvania, raising children, attending Methodist services on Sundays, occasionally being interviewed by historians and authors. The Cologne footage had become famous. The names of the men who had appeared in it had not. The Army's recognition came late, very late, and at a moment when most of the men who should have received it had already died. Smoyer, who had been the gunner, was the one still around to receive the medal. He held the medal in his hand. He looked at the cameras. He was photographed standing next to the Pershing tank that the Army had brought in for the ceremony, the same model he had fought in. The tank was almost certainly not Eagle 7. Eagle 7 had not survived the war, or had survived it and been scrapped in some post-war disposal. But the tank standing on the National Mall in 2019 was, mechanically and metallurgically, the same machine he had fired 3 rounds from in 1945.
The story of the M26 Pershing is not properly a story about engineering. The engineering was sound. The tank that the Ordnance Department designed in 1942 and 1943 was the right tank, with the right gun, the right armor, the right transmission. The mechanical decisions made by Gladian Barnes and the design teams at Detroit Arsenal and Aberdeen Proving Ground were not the problem. The problem was institutional. The problem was that the United States Army of 1943 was led at its ground forces command level by a man who had built his entire career around an artillery-centric doctrine that did not believe tanks should be the primary anti-tank weapon. McNair's tank-destroyer doctrine, internally consistent and procedurally defensible, was not what American tank crews needed in 1944. The crews needed Pershings. They got tank destroyers. They paid for that mismatch with their lives, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the streets of Aachen and the forest of the Hurtgen and the snow of the Ardennes. The Pershing arrived in time to participate in the final 10 weeks of the European War. It did not arrive in time to fight the battles that had needed it. The Sherman crews who had been killed by Panthers in 1944 did not have their lives restored by the Pershing's victory in front of Cologne Cathedral. Belton Cooper, the ordnance lieutenant whose Death Traps memoir would become the most quoted source on this topic in the 1990s, never forgave the Army for what he saw as the institutional failure to deliver the M26 a year earlier. His critique was sometimes hyperbolic and sometimes mistaken about specific causes, but his fundamental observation that the American Army had built the wrong tank for too long because the wrong man was making the decisions was correct. The Pershing was the right tank. It came late. The lateness was not an engineering problem, it was a doctrine problem and a personality problem and a procurement problem, and it cost American tank crews more than the post-war Army has been willing to acknowledge.
The M26 Pershing today sits in museums across the United States and in a few overseas collections. There is one at Patton in Fort Knox. There is one at Aberdeen in the Ordnance Collection. There is one at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. There is one at the Wright Museum in New Hampshire. There is one at the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Moore in Georgia. Visitors walk past them mostly on their way to the Shermans, which is what visitors come to see. The Sherman is the icon, the Pershing is the footnote. But the Pershing has a different kind of legacy. Its descendants populated the United States Army for the next 40 years. Its engineering principles, the long-sloped frontal armor, the high-velocity main gun, the torsion bar suspension, the cast turret, became the template for every American medium and main battle tank from 1945 until the introduction of the M1 Abrams in 1980. The Cold War armored force that confronted the Warsaw Pact across the Fulda Gap was, in its lineage, a Pershing force. The M26 had been a transitional tank, a bridge between the medium tanks of the Second World War and the main battle tanks of the post-war era, and the bridge had been built well enough that everything that came after stood on it for 35 years. In a war decided by what arrived in time, the M26 did not arrive in time. It was finished just as the war ended. The 20 tanks that fought in Europe killed a small number of German tanks, generated a famous piece of newsreel footage, gave Sergeant Maschlenik a Tiger kill and Corporal Smoyer a Panther kill, and then were shipped to a Pacific War that ended before they could fight. The 2,000 other Pershings, built but never used in the war they had been designed for, sat in storage yards for 5 years and then went to fight a war nobody had built them for, against an enemy whose tank had been their original target, in a country none of their designers had ever considered. The M26 fought its war eventually. It just fought it on a different continent against a different army in a different decade. That is the story of the tank America finished just as the war ended. The engineering was right, the timing was wrong. The men who designed it and the men who built it and the men who fought it understood, even at the time, that they had produced the right answer to a question that had stopped being asked the month their answer arrived. But the answer turned out, in the longer history of American armor, to have been a more durable answer than the question it had originally been built to address. The Pershing did not change the Second World War. It did, in time, change everything that came after. In a war decided by what worked, what eventually worked was a tank that had been built too late to matter, and that mattered for the next 40 years anyway. It was enough.